Imagine standing in the middle of an ancient labyrinth, its walls towering above you, carved from stone that feels colder than the air around it. Each turn presents two paths, left or right, and every decision takes you deeper into the maze. There are no maps, no guides, only your instincts and the faint echo of footsteps behind you. Now ask yourself this: are you truly choosing your path, or is the labyrinth deciding for you? This question isn't just about mazes, it's about life itself. Every day, we face choices large and small, believing they define who we are. But what if those choices aren't as free as they seem? Philosophers have wrestled with this idea for centuries. Thinkers like Baruch Spinoza argued that everything we do is predetermined by forces beyond our control, our genetics, upbringing, even the laws of physics. If he were alive today, Spinoza might point to neuroscience, which shows how much of our behavior stems from unconscious processes in the brain. Yet others, like Jean-Paul Sartre, insisted that humans possess radical freedom, the ability to choose regardless of circumstances. He famously said, "We are condemned to be free. So which is it? Are we prisoners of fate or architects of our destiny?" Let me tell you a story. Once, there was a man named Elias who lived in a quiet village nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. For years, Elias worked as a blacksmith, crafting tools and weapons for his neighbors. His days followed a predictable rhythm: wake at dawn, work until dusk, eat dinner alone, sleep. One evening, while repairing a plow under flickering candlelight, Elias paused and stared at his hands, calloused, scarred, weathered by time. A thought struck him, unbidden yet undeniable. Is this all I am meant to be? That night, unable to shake the question, Elias made a choice. He packed a bag, left his forge untouched, and walked out of the village before sunrise. What drove him to leave? Was it courage, desperation, or something else entirely? Modern psychology offers clues. Studies show that when people feel trapped by their circumstances, they experience what researchers call learned helplessness. They stop trying to change their situation because they believe effort won't matter. But here's the twist. Other studies reveal that even imagining a single alternative can spark hope. When Elias stepped onto the road leading away from his village, he wasn't just leaving. He was reclaiming agency over his life. And yet, did he really choose freely, or were his actions shaped by years of dissatisfaction simmering beneath the surface? Consider this paradox. Freedom requires constraints. Without walls, there is no labyrinth. Without limits, there are no choices. Take language, for example. We express ourselves through words, but those words come prepackaged, with meanings handed down through generations. Our thoughts are shaped by grammar, syntax, and cultural norms. Even rebellion against these structures relies on them. So is true freedom possible, or are we forever bound by the frameworks within which we exist? Pause for a moment and reflect. Have you ever felt utterly certain about a decision, only to later wonder why you chose it? Perhaps you picked a career because it seemed practical, married someone because everyone expected it, or stayed silent during a heated argument because speaking up felt too risky. These moments hint at a deeper truth. Much of what we call choice is influenced by invisible forces: society, biology, habit. Yet knowing this doesn't diminish the importance of choice. In fact, it amplifies it. Now let's return to Elias. As he journeyed farther from his village, the landscape shifted. The familiar green fields gave way to jagged cliffs overlooking endless seas. At one point, he encountered a traveler sitting cross-legged on a rock, sketching patterns in the dirt. The stranger looked up and asked, "Why do you walk?" Elias hesitated. How could he explain the restless longing that had driven him from home? "To find myself," he finally replied. The traveler smiled knowingly. "Be careful," he said. "Sometimes the self we seek isn't the one we want to find." What did the traveler mean? Could it be that freedom isn't about escaping constraints, but embracing them? Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, believed that meaning arises not from avoiding suffering, but from confronting it head-on. In the concentration camps, where prisoners had almost no control over their lives, Frankl observed that those who found purpose, even in the smallest acts of kindness or resistance, were more likely to survive. Their freedom lay not in changing their external conditions, but in choosing how to respond internally. So where does this leave us? Is freedom an illusion, a privilege, or a responsibility? Maybe it's all three. Maybe the real question isn't whether we're free, but how we use whatever freedom we have. Because here's the thing. Whether our choices are determined by fate or forged in the crucible of will, they still shape the world around us. They ripple outward, affecting others in ways we may never fully understand. The labyrinth stretched endlessly before Elias, its twists and turns mirroring the chaos of his own mind. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself conspired to slow him down. Yet with every labored stride he noticed something peculiar, faint carvings etched into the stone walls. At first glance, they seemed random scratches, perhaps, left by others who had wandered here before him. But upon closer inspection, patterns emerged. Symbols, shapes, even fragments of sentences appeared, half buried beneath layers of moss and grime. One phrase stood out starkly: "Freedom begins where certainty ends." Elias traced the letters with trembling fingers. What did it mean? Certainty had been his anchor for so long, the predictable rhythm of hammer against anvil, the comfort of knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring. Now, stripped of that certainty, he felt adrift. And yet, wasn't this why he'd left? To break free from the chains of routine, to seek something more. The irony struck him like a blow. In leaving behind the familiar, he had entered a place far less certain, but infinitely richer in possibility. Centuries earlier, René Descartes sat alone in a small room, grappling with questions that would shape Western thought for generations. Like Elias, Descartes sought clarity amidst confusion. He doubted everything, his senses, his memories, even the existence of the physical world, until he arrived at one undeniable truth: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. From this foundation, he rebuilt his understanding of reality. But what if Descartes had taken his doubt further? What if he questioned not just the external world, but the very nature of thought itself? After all, our thoughts are often shaped by forces we don't control: emotions, biases, societal expectations. Can we truly claim ownership of them? As Elias continued through the labyrinth, the symbols grew denser, their meanings more cryptic. Some depicted scenes of triumph, a figure scaling a mountain, arms raised in victory. Others showed despair, a lone silhouette collapsing under the weight of unseen burdens. Together, they formed a mosaic of human experience, each image a fragment of the whole. It occurred to Elias that freedom might be less about escaping suffering and more about integrating it. Pain and joy, loss and gain. They were two sides of the same coin, inseparable yet distinct. To reject one was to diminish the other. Modern psychology echoes this idea. Researchers studying resilience have found that individuals who thrive after adversity often share a common trait. They reinterpret their struggles as opportunities for growth. This process, known as cognitive reappraisal, allows people to reframe negative experiences in ways that foster strength rather than defeat. For instance, someone who loses their job might view it not as failure, but as a chance to pursue a long-abandoned passion. Such reframing doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. It turns the labyrinth's dead ends into doorways, but transformation comes at a cost. As Elias pressed on, the air grew colder, the light dimmer. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. He began to hear whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first he tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the steady crunch of his boots against the stone floor. But the voices persisted, growing louder, clearer. "Turn back," they urged. "You'll never escape." Their words clawed at his resolve, planting seeds of doubt that threatened to take root. This, too, is part of the human condition. Doubt is both adversary and ally. It challenges us to question assumptions, to test beliefs against evidence. Yet unchecked, it can paralyze us, trapping us in cycles of indecision. Philosophers like David Hume explored this tension, arguing that reason alone cannot guide action. Emotion must play a role. Without desire, without passion, life becomes stagnant, a ship adrift without wind or current. Elias knew this instinctively. Despite the whispers, despite the gnawing fear in his chest, he kept moving forward, not because he was certain of success, but because standing still meant surrender. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had lost all meaning inside the labyrinth. Finally, Elias reached a chamber unlike any he'd seen before. Its ceiling soared high above, disappearing into shadow. In the center stood a pedestal, atop which rested a single object, a mirror. Curious, Elias approached it cautiously. When he looked into the glass, he saw not his reflection but countless versions of himself. Some smiled confidently, eyes bright with purpose. Others wore expressions of anguish, faces streaked with tears. Still others stared blankly, hollow-eyed and empty. Which one was real? Or were they all facets of the same self, scattered across moments in time? The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote that becoming who you are requires embracing contradictions. Life is messy, chaotic, full of paradoxes. To live authentically is to accept this complexity, to hold opposing truths in tension without seeking resolution. Perhaps the mirror reflected not just Elias's past and present, but also his potential futures. Each version represented a choice, a path untaken. And now, standing before them, he understood. Freedom isn't about choosing the right path. It's about accepting responsibility for whichever path you choose. With newfound clarity, Elias stepped away from the mirror. The whispers faded, replaced by silence so profound it hummed in his ears. For the first time since entering the labyrinth, he felt calm, not the calm of resignation but of acceptance. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it head on. Because now he knew, the labyrinth wasn't designed to trap him, it was built to teach him. And so, with steady breaths and resolute heart, Elias moved forward once more. The silence that followed Elias was deafening, a void so complete it seemed to press against his skin like a weight. Yet within that silence, he found something unexpected, clarity. The labyrinth no longer felt like a prison, but rather a crucible, a place where the raw materials of his identity were being forged into something stronger, sharper. Each step now carried purpose, as though the ground beneath him recognized his transformation. He began to notice subtle changes in the walls around him. The carvings, once cryptic and fragmented, now told a coherent story, one that mirrored his own journey. At one turn, he paused before a carving of two figures locked in combat. One wielded a sword, its blade gleaming with precision. The other fought with bare hands, their knuckles bloodied but unyielding. The contrast struck him deeply. Was this a metaphor for the choices we face? To arm ourselves with knowledge and strategy, or to rely on instinct and resilience? Both paths led to victory, but at what cost? Elias thought back to his life in the village, where every decision had been safe, calculated, predictable. Leaving had been an act of rebellion, yes, but also an admission of weakness, the inability to confront dissatisfaction without fleeing. Had he chosen the sword or the fist? Or was there another way entirely? Philosophers have long debated the nature of human agency. Immanuel Kant argued that true freedom lies not in acting on impulse, but in adhering to moral law, a kind of self-imposed discipline that elevates us above mere animals. By contrast, existentialists like Sartre rejected such rigid frameworks, insisting that authenticity arises from embracing radical freedom, even when it terrifies us. For Elias, standing before the carved fighters, neither perspective felt wholly satisfying. Perhaps freedom wasn't about choosing between order and chaos, but finding balance between them, a harmony that allowed both structure and spontaneity to coexist. As he moved deeper into the labyrinth, the air grew warmer, carrying with it the faint scent of earth after rain. It was a comforting smell, one that stirred memories of his childhood. Days spent running through fields, climbing trees, dreaming of adventures beyond the horizon. Those dreams had faded over time, buried under layers of responsibility and routine. But here, in this strange and shifting maze, they resurfaced with startling vividness. Elias realized that the labyrinth wasn't just testing his resolve, it was forcing him to reconnect with parts of himself he'd forgotten, or perhaps deliberately abandoned. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as self-complexity, the idea that our identities are composed of multiple roles, traits, and experiences. When we suppress certain aspects of ourselves, our creativity, our vulnerability, our ambition, we limit our capacity for growth. Studies show that individuals with higher self-complexity tend to cope better with stress because they can draw on a wider range of resources. For Elias, the labyrinth was revealing hidden facets of his personality, forcing him to integrate them into a more cohesive whole. With each step, he felt less like a single man and more like a mosaic of possibilities. Yet integration came with challenges. Around another bend, Elias encountered a narrow bridge spanning a chasm so deep its bottom disappeared into shadow. The planks creaked ominously underfoot, and the wind howled through the gap, tugging at his clothes. Halfway across, he froze, gripped by a sudden wave of vertigo. Below him yawned not just the abyss, but the fear of failure, the terror of falling short, of being consumed by the very doubts that had driven him into the labyrinth in the first place. Could he trust himself to cross, or would the weight of his insecurities drag him down? This moment of hesitation is universal. Every great leap, whether literal or metaphorical, demands faith in oneself. Psychologist Abraham Maslow described this as the pinnacle of human development, self-actualization, the realization of one's full potential. But reaching this stage requires confronting fears head-on, stepping into the unknown despite uncertainty. Elias took a deep breath, focusing on the rhythm of his heartbeat. Slowly, deliberately, he placed one foot in front of the other until he reached the far side. As he stepped onto solid ground, a sense of triumph washed over him, not because the crossing had been easy, but because he had faced his fear and prevailed. Beyond the bridge, the labyrinth opened into a vast chamber illuminated by shafts of golden light streaming through cracks in the ceiling. In the center stood a tree, its branches stretching toward the heavens, its roots burrowing deep into the earth. Carved into its trunk were words written in a language Elias didn't recognize, yet somehow he understood their meaning. To be free is to belong, to yourself, to others, to the world. The message resonated deeply. Freedom, he realized, wasn't about isolation or escape. It was about connection, the threads that bind us to our past, our present, and our future. Elias rested beneath the tree, allowing himself a rare moment of stillness. He thought of the villagers he'd left behind, wondering if they ever questioned their own lives the way he had. Did they feel trapped too, or had they found contentment in simplicity? Perhaps freedom wasn't a destination but a process, a continual negotiation between who we are and who we aspire to be. As he sat there, watching dust motes dance in the sunlight, Elias felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the answers he'd uncovered, but for the questions themselves. They reminded him that life, like the labyrinth, is never static. It evolves, shifts, transforms. When he finally rose to continue his journey, Elias noticed something new. The walls of the labyrinth were beginning to recede, dissolving into mist. Ahead, a faint glow hinted at an exit. For the first time since entering, he allowed himself to hope, not for escape, but for understanding. Whatever awaited him beyond the labyrinth, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the same man who had walked in. The glow ahead grew brighter, pulsing softly like the first light of dawn breaking through a storm. Elias quickened his pace, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. Yet as he neared the source of the light, something unexpected happened. The labyrinth didn't simply end, it unraveled. The walls dissolved into ribbons of mist that swirled around him, wrapping him in a cocoon of fleeting memories and half-forgotten dreams. He saw flashes of his childhood, the laughter of friends, the warmth of his mother's embrace, the sting of a teacher's reprimand. He saw moments from his years as a blacksmith, the satisfaction of hammer meeting metal, the frustration of a flawed blade, the quiet pride of handing someone a tool they needed to build their life. And then, more abstract images began to surface. Fragments of conversations, faces he barely recognized, emotions too raw to articulate. It was overwhelming, this flood of sensations, yet strangely liberating. For so long, Elias had compartmentalized his experiences, locking away pieces of himself that didn't fit neatly into the narrative he'd constructed. But now, standing at the threshold of whatever lay beyond, those fragments came rushing back, not as disjointed shards, but as threads weaving together a tapestry far richer than anything he could have imagined. It occurred to him that freedom wasn't about shedding these parts of himself. It was about reclaiming them, integrating them into a coherent whole. Philosophers like Martin Heidegger might describe this moment as authentic being, a state where one fully inhabits their existence rather than drifting through it unconsciously. Heidegger argued that most people live in what he called the they, a collective mindset shaped by societal expectations and norms. To break free from the they is to confront the weight of your own individuality, to take ownership of your choices and responsibilities. As Elias stood enveloped in the swirling mists of memory, he understood this truth viscerally. His journey hadn't been about escaping the constraints of his old life, but about embracing the fullness of who he was and who he could become. The mist began to clear, revealing not an exit but another chamber. This one was unlike any he'd encountered before. Its walls shimmered with liquid light, shifting colors like oil on water. In the center floated a sphere, translucent and humming faintly, as though alive. Elias approached cautiously, his footsteps silent against the smooth, glass-like floor. When he reached out to touch the sphere, it pulsed in response, sending waves of color rippling across its surface. Then, without warning, it spoke, not in words but in impressions, feelings, images that flooded his mind. He saw civilizations rising and falling, empires crumbling into dust only to be reborn anew. He witnessed acts of unimaginable cruelty and breathtaking kindness, each leaving ripples that echoed through time. He felt the weight of countless lives intertwined, their joys and sorrows indistinguishable, their fates bound together in ways no single person could ever comprehend. And amidst it all, he saw himself, not as a solitary figure navigating the labyrinth, but as part of something vast and interconnected, a thread in a web stretching infinitely in every direction. This realization struck him with the force of revelation. Freedom, he realized, wasn't just personal, it was relational. Every choice we make sends ripples outward, affecting others in ways we may never see. Psychologist Albert Bandura called this phenomenon reciprocal determinism, the idea that our actions shape our environment, which in turn shapes us. But Elias understood it on a deeper level now. We are not islands adrift in a sea of chaos. We are nodes in a network, constantly influencing and being influenced by those around us. To be free is not to sever these connections, but to honor them, to recognize that our liberation depends not only on ourselves, but on the communities we create and sustain. As the vision faded, the sphere dimmed, retreating into stillness. Elias stepped back, shaken but invigorated. The labyrinth had stripped him bare, forcing him to confront fears, doubts, and desires he'd buried long ago. Now, standing in this luminous chamber, he felt whole, not because he had resolved every question, but because he had embraced the complexity of living without answers. Life itself was the labyrinth, endlessly unfolding, challenging, transforming. There was no final destination, only the journey. But even as this understanding settled over him, a new challenge emerged. A doorway appeared in the far wall, framed by light so intense it seemed almost solid. Beyond it lay something, Elias couldn't tell what exactly, but he felt its pull, a magnetic force tugging at his very core. Was this the way out, or merely another layer of the labyrinth? Either way, he knew he had no choice but to step through. Not because he sought escape, but because the act of moving forward was itself an expression of freedom. Taking a deep breath, Elias crossed the threshold. The light enveloped him completely, dissolving everything, the chamber, the sphere, even his own body, into pure sensation. For a moment, he existed nowhere and everywhere, unbound by form or time. Then, slowly, the world rematerialized around him. He found himself standing on a hill overlooking a sprawling city bathed in twilight. Its streets buzzed with activity, its buildings reaching skyward like hands yearning for connection. Somewhere within it, he sensed, lay the next chapter of his story. Elias smiled, not with triumph, but with anticipation. Whatever challenges awaited him here, he would face them not as a wanderer lost in uncertainty, but as someone who had learned to navigate the labyrinth within. Because now, he understood, true freedom isn't about finding the right path. It's about creating meaning along the way. And with that thought, he descended the hill, ready to begin again. The city unfolded before Elias like a living organism, its pulse synchronized with the rhythm of countless lives intertwined. Each street was a vein, each building a cell, and the air hummed with the collective energy of humanity striving, surviving, dreaming. As he walked, the cacophony of voices, footsteps, and distant music enveloped him, yet strangely, it didn't overwhelm. Instead, it felt familiar, as if this place, though foreign, echoed something deep within him. He realized that the labyrinth hadn't ended, it had merely transformed. The walls of stone had given way to streets of cobblestone, and the twists and turns now took the form of alleys, markets, and crowded squares. Freedom, he mused, wasn't about escaping constraints, but learning to navigate them. He paused at a bustling marketplace, where vendors shouted over one another, hawking wares ranging from fragrant spices to intricate trinkets. A boy no older than 10 darted through the crowd, clutching a loaf of bread under his arm, pursued by an irate baker. Elias watched as the scene unfolded, the boy's desperate sprint, the baker's futile chase, the murmurs of onlookers torn between amusement and disapproval. It struck him how every action here rippled outward. The boy's theft might mean survival for his family, while the baker's loss could jeopardize his livelihood. Even in such a small moment, choices collided, creating consequences neither party could fully foresee. This interplay of cause and effect fascinated philosophers like John Stuart Mill, who argued that human behavior should be judged not by intentions alone, but by outcomes. His utilitarian philosophy posited that the greatest good comes from actions that maximize happiness and minimize suffering. Yet Elias wondered, how could anyone truly predict the ripple effects of their decisions? The boy stealing bread might save his siblings from hunger today, but what if his actions inspired others to steal, eroding trust within the community? Conversely, punishing him harshly might deter future crimes but also crush his spirit irreparably. Life, Elias thought, was far too complex for simple moral equations. As he moved deeper into the city, the atmosphere shifted. The vibrant chaos of the market gave way to quieter neighborhoods, where homes stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows glowing warmly against the encroaching night. Here, life seemed slower, more deliberate. An elderly woman sat on her porch, knitting by lamplight, while children played tag in the street, their laughter ringing out like bells. Elias lingered, watching them, feeling an ache of nostalgia for a childhood he barely remembered. These moments, ordinary, fleeting, were the threads that held society together, invisible yet unbreakable. But even in this idyllic setting, shadows lurked. Further down the road, a man leaned against a lamppost, his face gaunt, his clothes threadbare. Passers-by avoided eye contact, stepping around him as if he were part of the scenery. Elias hesitated, torn between compassion and discomfort. What responsibility did he have to this stranger? Was it his duty to help, Or was it enough simply to acknowledge the man's existence? The question gnawed at him, reminding him of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Act only according to maxims that could become universal laws. If everyone ignored those in need, what kind of world would result? Before he could decide, a young girl approached the man holding out a piece of fruit. Her gesture was simple, almost shy, yet it carried profound weight. The man accepted it with a nod, his eyes softening momentarily before returning to their weary gaze. Elias felt a pang of shame, not because he hadn't acted, but because he'd hesitated. In that hesitation lay the essence of freedom, the ability to choose, yes, but also the burden of accountability. Every choice we make defines not just ourselves, but the world we inhabit. Determined to move forward, Elias continued his journey, eventually reaching a grand plaza dominated by a towering statue. The figure depicted a man with arms outstretched, gazing skyward, his expression one of defiance and hope. Beneath it, an inscription read, "To rise is to resist." The words resonated deeply, evoking memories of his own struggles, the doubts, fears, and sacrifices that had brought him here. Resistance, he realized, wasn't always dramatic or heroic. Sometimes it was quiet, internal, a refusal to accept despair, a commitment to keep moving despite uncertainty. Psychologists often speak of resilience as the capacity to adapt and grow in the face of adversity, but Elias understood it differently now. Resilience wasn't merely bouncing back, it was pushing forward, carving new paths where none existed. It required courage, yes, but also vulnerability, the willingness to confront pain without letting it define you. He thought of Viktor Frankl again, whose insistence on finding meaning in suffering had saved not only himself, but countless others. Meaning, Elias realized, wasn't something you discovered externally. It was something you created internally, shaping it from the raw materials of your experiences. Night fell fully, casting the city in hues of silver and shadow. Street lamps flickered to life, their glow pooling on the pavement like spilled starlight. Elias wandered aimlessly, allowing the city to guide him. At one point, he found himself drawn to a small theater tucked away in a narrow alley. Its marquee advertised a performance titled The Mirror of Tomorrow, and though he knew nothing of it, he felt compelled to enter. Inside, the space was intimate, the seats arranged in a circle around a central stage. The audience was sparse, perhaps 24 people scattered throughout, their faces illuminated by dim, amber lights. When the performance began, Elias realized it wasn't a traditional play, but an interactive experience. Actors moved among the crowd, engaging spectators in dialogue, inviting them to share fragments of their stories. One woman spoke of losing her child, her voice trembling but resolute. A man recounted his battle with addiction, his words raw and unfiltered. Another participant, a teenager, confessed her fear of failure, her voice barely above a whisper. As each story unfolded, Elias felt the weight of their collective humanity pressing upon him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of connection. By the end, the performers gathered on stage, forming a tableau that mirrored the audience itself. They recited a final line in unison, "We are all mirrors reflecting one another's light." The phrase lingered in the air long after the curtain fell, echoing in Elias's mind as he stepped back into the cool night. He understood now that freedom wasn't solitary, it was shared. Our choices, our struggles, our triumphs, they don't exist in isolation. They reflect and refract, illuminating paths for others even as we stumble along our own. As he walked away from the theater, Elias noticed something remarkable. The city seemed different. The same streets, buildings, and people remained, yet they appeared sharper, more vivid, as if seen through fresh eyes. Perhaps this was the true gift of the labyrinth, not escape, but transformation. By confronting his innermost fears and desires, Elias had emerged not as someone new, but as someone whole. And now, standing amidst the pulsing heart of the city, he felt ready to embrace whatever came next, not as a wanderer seeking answers, but as a creator forging meaning from the chaos. The city seemed alive in a way Elias had never encountered before, as if its pulse matched the rhythm of his own thoughts. Each step he took resonated with purpose, yet uncertainty lingered like a shadow at his heels. He found himself drawn to a narrow alleyway lined with bookstalls, their shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten tomes and weathered manuscripts. The scent of aged paper and ink hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. It was here, amidst this quiet chaos, that Elias stumbled upon a book unlike any he'd ever seen. Its cover was unremarkable plain leather, cracked with age, but when he opened it, the pages shimmered faintly, as though they contained not ink but liquid light. The text shifted as he read, rearranging itself into words and phrases tailored to his gaze. At first, he thought it absurd, a trick of the dim lanterns casting flickering shadows. But then he realized the book wasn't static. It responded to him, adapting to his questions, fears, and desires. On one page, he saw fragments of philosophy. Freedom is not the absence of chains, but the mastery of them. On another, psychological insights emerged. To know oneself is to rewrite the script of your life. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a book. It was a mirror, one that reflected not his face but his mind. As he turned the pages, he began to see patterns emerge, threads connecting ideas he'd once thought unrelated. The labyrinth, the city, the people, all were part of an intricate web of meaning, each strand vibrating with potential. He recalled Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher who claimed that no man ever steps in the same river twice. Life, like water, is always in motion, constantly reshaping itself. And now, holding this living book, Elias understood why. We are co-creators of our reality, shaping and being shaped by the flow of existence. But the book offered more than wisdom. It posed challenges. One passage stopped him cold. If you could erase one memory, what would it be? And what would you lose in doing so? The question struck a nerve. Memories, after all, define us. They are the raw materials from which we construct our identities. To erase even a painful one would mean losing a piece of ourselves. Yet how many times had Elias wished he could forget moments of regret, shame, or grief? How often had he fantasized about starting over with a clean slate? Psychologists refer to this tension as memory integration, the process by which we reconcile past experiences with present understanding. Trauma, guilt, and loss don't vanish, they transform. Studies show that individuals who successfully integrate difficult memories tend to experience greater emotional resilience. For Elias, the book's challenge forced him to confront a truth he'd long avoided. His journey through the labyrinth hadn't been about escaping his past, but about reclaiming it. Every scar, every mistake, every moment of doubt had led him here, to this city, this moment, this book. As he closed the cover, the stall owner approached, a wizened figure with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. "You found something rare," the old man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Few can read what lies within those pages. Fewer still can act on it." Elias frowned. "Act on what?" he asked. The man smiled enigmatically. "Knowledge without application is vanity. What will you do with what you've learned?" The question lingered long after Elias left the stall, the book tucked securely under his arm. He wandered aimlessly, letting his feet carry him wherever they pleased. Eventually, he arrived at a bridge spanning a wide canal. Lanterns hung from iron posts, their reflections dancing on the water below. A musician sat cross-legged near the railing, playing a haunting melody on a stringed instrument. The notes seemed to rise and fall like waves, pulling at something deep within Elias. He leaned against the railing, watching the ripples distort the lamplight and let the music wash over him. It occurred to him that life itself was like this bridge, a fragile structure suspended between two unknowns. We move forward, step by step, trusting that the ground beneath us will hold. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when the bridge collapses, leaving us stranded midstream? Fear whispered in his ear, what if you fail? What if everything you've built crumbles into nothingness? Yet alongside the fear came a quieter voice, steady and resolute. Failure is not the end. It is merely another turn in the labyrinth. This duality fascinated philosophers like Nietzsche, who argued that suffering is essential to growth. In his view, adversity forces us to confront our weaknesses, forging strength in the crucible of hardship. But Elias saw it differently now. Suffering wasn't inherently transformative. It was what we did with it that mattered. Like the musician on the bridge, whose sorrowful tune carried beauty despite its melancholy, we have the power to shape our pain into art, meaning, connection. Lost in thought, Elias barely noticed the figure approaching until she spoke. You look troubled, she said softly. Startled, he turned to see a woman standing beside him, her features obscured by the hood of her cloak. Her voice was gentle, almost melodic, and there was something in her presence that made him feel both uneasy and comforted. Not troubled, he replied cautiously. Just thinking. She nodded as if she understood perfectly. Thinking is dangerous, she said. It leads to questions, and questions lead to change. Before Elias could respond, she gestured toward the musician. Do you hear it? The song he plays, it's beautiful, yes, but it's also incomplete. Music needs silence to breathe. Without pauses, without emptiness, it becomes noise. She paused, her gaze piercing. So too with life. Sometimes the most profound answers lie in the spaces between. Her words struck a chord deep within him. For so long Elias had sought clarity, certainty, resolution. But perhaps the true essence of freedom lay not in finding answers, but in embracing the questions themselves. Questions create space for possibility, for reinvention. They remind us that life is not a puzzle to be solved, but a story to be written and rewritten with every choice we make. When the woman finally walked away, disappearing into the crowd, Elias felt a strange sense of gratitude. He didn't know who she was or why she'd spoken to him, but her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind like the musician's lingering notes. Slowly he straightened, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever challenges awaited him in this city, or beyond, he would face them not with the need for closure, but with the courage to remain open. As he crossed the bridge, the canal stretched out behind him, its waters reflecting the starlit sky. Ahead, the city loomed, vast and unknowable, its streets winding like veins through a living organism. Somewhere within it lay the next chapter of his journey. And though he couldn't see the path clearly, he trusted that it would reveal itself. One step, one question, one moment of uncertainty at a time. Elias stepped off the bridge and into a plaza that seemed to hum with an energy all its own. The air was alive, charged with the kind of anticipation that precedes a storm. Around him, people moved with purpose, some laughing, others arguing, many simply existing in quiet solitude. Yet beneath the surface of their actions, Elias sensed a shared undercurrent, a collective yearning for something unnamed, something just out of reach. It wasn't happiness or success or even meaning. It was something deeper, more primal, a desire to matter. He found himself drawn to a fountain at the center of the plaza. Its waters cascaded down tiers of stone carved with intricate patterns, spirals, waves, and fractals that seemed to pulse faintly, as if imbued with life. At its base, coins glittered like fallen stars, each one a wish cast into the depths by someone hoping for change. Elias knelt beside the fountain, his fingers brushing the cool surface of the water. He thought about the book tucked under his arm, the living text that had challenged him to confront his memories, his fears, his choices. What would he toss into these waters? What fragment of himself would he surrender to the unknown? Philosophers have long debated the nature of human desire. Plato argued that all longing stems from a yearning for unity, a return to a state of wholeness we once knew but lost. Freud, on the other hand, saw desire as rooted in lack, a perpetual striving to fill the voids within us. Both perspectives resonated with Elias, yet neither fully captured the complexity of what he felt now. Desire wasn't just about absence or completion. It was about becoming. Each wish thrown into the fountain represented not just a hope for fulfillment, but a commitment to transformation. As he stood, a child darted past him, giggling as she flung a coin into the water. Her laughter was infectious, drawing smiles from those nearby. Watching her, Elias realized how effortlessly children embody freedom. They don't question their right to dream, to play, to imagine worlds beyond the visible. Somewhere along the way, adults lose that certainty, not because they stop desiring, but because they begin to doubt whether their desires are valid. Society teaches them to prioritize practicality over passion, security over spontaneity. The labyrinth, Elias thought, wasn't just a physical construct. It was a metaphor for this internal erosion, this gradual narrowing of possibility. But here in this plaza, surrounded by strangers whose lives intertwined in ways none of them could fully grasp, Elias felt a flicker of rebellion. Why should anyone accept such limitations? Freedom, after all, isn't given, it's claimed. And claiming it requires audacity, the willingness to defy expectations and embrace uncertainty. He thought of Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote that true freedom arises when we reject the roles imposed upon us and instead create our own meanings. To do so is to step into the unknown, to become both artist and artwork, shaping ourselves through the act of living. With newfound resolve, Elias reached into his pocket and retrieved a small object, a shard of metal he'd carried since leaving the village. It was a fragment of a broken blade, the first tool he'd ever forged as a blacksmith. For years, it had symbolized failure, a reminder of his imperfections. Now, holding it in his palm, he saw it differently. It wasn't a relic of inadequacy. It was proof of effort, of growth. Slowly, deliberately, he tossed it into the fountain. The splash was soft, barely audible amidst the din of the plaza, but the act itself felt monumental. He wasn't discarding the past. He was integrating it, allowing it to flow forward into whatever came next. The moment passed, and Elias turned away from the fountain, feeling lighter somehow. His gaze fell on a cafe across the square, its windows glowing warmly against the night. Inside, patrons sat huddled around tables, sharing meals and conversations. Something about the scene tugged at him, urging him closer. As he entered, the scent of roasted coffee and freshly baked bread enveloped him, grounding him in the present. He chose a seat near the window, where he could watch the plaza while sipping a cup of steaming tea. From his vantage point, Elias observed the ebb and flow of human connection. A couple whispered conspiratorially, their hands intertwined. An elderly man read aloud from a newspaper to a friend who leaned in attentively. Strangers exchanged brief smiles before returning to their separate worlds. These interactions, though fleeting, carried weight. They reminded Elias of something psychologist Erich Fromm once wrote, that love is not merely a feeling but an active force, a way of relating to the world. To love is to affirm life, to see another person not as an object but as a subject, worthy of dignity and respect. And yet, love is also risky. To open yourself to another is to invite vulnerability, the possibility of rejection or loss. Elias thought of the villages he'd left behind, the friends he'd abandoned, the relationships he'd neglected. Had he been afraid to truly connect, to let others see the parts of himself he deemed unworthy? Perhaps the labyrinth hadn't been about escaping loneliness, but about confronting it, learning to carry it without letting it define him. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a young woman who slid into the seat across from him. She introduced herself as Mira, explaining that she'd noticed him at the fountain and felt compelled to speak. There was an intensity to her presence, a directness that disarmed him. "You look like someone carrying a heavy burden," she said, her eyes searching his face. "Or maybe someone who's finally ready to set it down." Her words startled him, not because they were profound, but because they were true. For days, weeks, perhaps even years, Elias had carried the weight of his doubts, his regrets, his unanswered questions. But now, sitting in this cafe, Surrounded by strangers whose lives intersected in ways both visible and invisible, he realized he no longer needed to bear that weight alone. Freedom, he understood now, wasn't about independence. It was about interdependence. We are shaped by those we meet, just as we shape them in turn. Mira spoke of her own journey, her voice steady yet tinged with emotion. She described a life marked by loss and resilience, by moments of despair followed by unexpected grace. I used to think freedom meant having control, she admitted, but now I see it differently. It's about trust, not just in yourself but in the world around you, even when it hurts, even when it doesn't make sense. Her words lingered as they parted ways, leaving Elias to sit in silence, watching the plaza through the window. The fountain still shimmered, its waters reflecting the shifting lights of the city. People continued to move, to laugh, to dream, each one navigating their own labyrinth of choice and consequence. And Elias, for the first time in what felt like forever, felt at peace, not because he had answers, but because he trusted the process of seeking them. When he finally rose to leave, the cafe seemed quieter, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the shift within him. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, its streets winding like veins through a living organism. Somewhere within it lay the next chapter of his journey. And though he couldn't see the path clearly, he trusted that it would reveal itself, one step, one connection, one moment of trust at a time. Elias stepped out of the cafe and into the cool embrace of the night, the city's pulse thrumming around him like a second heartbeat. The streets were quieter now, their earlier vibrancy softened by the late hour, yet they still hummed with life. Whispers of conversations carried on the breeze, distant footsteps echoing against stone walls, the occasional flicker of lamplight casting shadows that danced and dissolved. He felt untethered, as though he were floating between worlds, the labyrinth behind him, its lessons etched into his soul, the city ahead, sprawling and infinite, a canvas waiting for new stories to be written upon it. As he walked, Elias noticed something peculiar, a faint glow emanating from an alleyway just wide enough for a single person to pass through. It wasn't the harsh glare of electric light, but something softer, warmer, almost organic. Drawn by curiosity, he stepped into the narrow passage, the walls closing in around him until he could touch them on either side. The air grew heavier here, tinged with the scent of earth and damp stone, and the sound of the city faded into a muffled silence. At the end of the alley stood a door, unremarkable save for the intricate carvings that adorned its surface, patterns resembling roots and branches, twisting together in an endless cycle of growth and decay. He hesitated before pushing it open, unsure what lay beyond. Inside, he found himself in a vast library, unlike any he'd ever seen. Shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, disappearing into darkness broken only by scattered pools of golden light. Books floated midair, their pages turning slowly as if stirred by an invisible breeze. The space was alive with movement, not chaotic but deliberate, each book finding its place as though guided by some unseen hand. In the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in shadow, seated at a desk covered in parchment scrolls and inkwells. When the figure spoke, their voice resonated like a chord struck on a harp, layered and resonant. "You've come far," they said without looking up, "but the journey is never truly over." Elias approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure chuckled softly, setting down the quill they had been using. "I am no one and everyone," they replied. "A keeper of stories, a witness to lives lived and unlived. You might call me a librarian." The answer unsettled Elias, not because it was cryptic, but because it felt true. This place, this person, it all seemed to exist outside the boundaries of time and logic, a nexus where past, present, and future converged. The librarian gestured for him to sit, and when Elias complied, they slid a blank sheet of parchment across the desk toward him. Beside it lay a pen, its nib gleaming faintly, as though it had been forged from starlight. "Right," the librarian instructed simply. Elias frowned, glancing between the parchment and the pen. Write what? Your story, came the reply. Not the one you've lived so far, but the one you wish to create. Every choice you make shapes the narrative of your life, but few take the time to write it themselves. Most let others dictate their chapters, their parents, their peers, their fears. But here, in this moment, you have the power to decide how your tale unfolds. The weight of the request settled over Elias like a mantle. For so long, he had thought of his life as something predetermined, a series of events strung together by forces beyond his control. Yet now, sitting in this impossible library, he understood that freedom wasn't about escaping those forces. It was about choosing how to respond to them. To write his own story was to reclaim agency, to assert his presence in a world that often sought to diminish it. He picked up the pen, its weight surprisingly comforting in his hand. At first, the page remained blank, his mind racing with possibilities. What should he write? Should he recount his journey through the labyrinth, detailing every trial and triumph? Or should he imagine a future yet unwritten, sketching out dreams he had long buried beneath layers of doubt? As he hesitated, the librarian leaned forward slightly, their face still obscured by shadow. Remember, they said gently, a story doesn't need to be perfect to be meaningful. It simply needs to be yours. Their words broke something loose within him, a dam releasing a flood of emotion. Without thinking, Elias began to write, not carefully or methodically, but with raw urgency. Words spilled onto the page in jagged lines, forming sentences that shifted and rearranged themselves as he went. He wrote of the blacksmith he had been, the wanderer he had become, and the creator he hoped to be. He wrote of fear and courage, loss and discovery, connection and solitude. He wrote of the villages he had left behind, the strangers he had met along the way, and the fragments of himself he had pieced back together. And as he wrote, the library seemed to respond, the floating books aligning themselves, the lights growing brighter, the air humming with a quiet energy. When he finally set the pen down, exhausted but exhilarated, the librarian nodded approvingly. Well done, they said. Now, take this. They handed him a small leather-bound journal, identical to the living book he had discovered in the market. This is your story, but it is also a mirror. Open it whenever you feel lost, and it will remind you of who you are and who you can become. Elias accepted the journal, feeling its weight settle into his hands like a promise. Before he could thank the librarian, the room began to shift, the shelves dissolving into mist, the floating books vanishing like embers caught in the wind. The librarian rose, their form dissolving into light, and with a final nod they were gone. Moments later, Elias found himself standing once more in the alleyway. The door behind him vanished as though it had never existed. He clutched the journal tightly, its presence grounding him as he stepped back into the city. The streets were unchanged, yet everything felt different. Each step he took resonated with purpose, each breath filled with possibility. He realized now that the labyrinth had never been about finding an exit. It had been about discovering the tools to navigate life itself. Freedom wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a continual act of creation. And so, with the journal tucked safely under his arm, Elias moved forward, ready to write the next chapter, not just for himself, but for the countless lives his choices would touch. Somewhere deep within him, he knew the journey would never truly end. But that was the beauty of it. The labyrinth wasn't meant to be escaped. It was meant to be lived. The city stretched before Elias, vast and unyielding, its streets winding like veins through a living organism. Each step he took carried the weight of all he had learned, the labyrinth's lessons etched into his mind, the journal in his hands pulsing faintly, as though it contained not just ink but the essence of his being. He felt no urgency now, no need to rush toward some imagined conclusion. Instead, he moved with deliberate calm, savoring the rhythm of his breath, the scrape of his boots against cobblestone, the hum of life that vibrated through every corner of this place. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. Elias found himself drawn to a park nestled at the edge of the city. It was quiet here, untouched by the bustle of commerce or the clamor of crowds. Trees stood tall and ancient, their branches interwoven like fingers reaching for something beyond the clouds. A narrow path wound through the green expanse, lined with benches where early risers sat in contemplation. He chose one near a small pond, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the first light of day. Sitting there, Elias opened the journal once more, not to write, but simply to hold it, to feel its presence. The pages were blank now, save for the words he had scrawled in the library, yet they seemed alive, brimming with potential. This wasn't just a record of his past. It was a map for his future, a reminder that freedom lay not in escaping uncertainty, but in embracing it. To live fully was to exist within paradox, to be both wanderer and creator, both question and answer. He thought of the librarian's parting words. This is your story, but it is also a mirror. At first, he hadn't understood what they meant. Now, sitting beneath the sprawling canopy of trees, he began to see. Stories shape us. They give form to chaos, meaning to suffering, direction to aimlessness. But they are also mirrors because they reflect who we are back at us, forcing us to confront our truths. Every choice Elias had made, every path he had taken, had been a brushstroke on the canvas of his life. And now, armed with this journal, he could continue painting, not to finish the picture but to deepen its colors, to make it richer, more complex. A soft rustling drew his attention. Across the pond, a heron stood motionless, its long neck poised like an arrow aimed at the heavens. For several minutes it didn't move, simply existing in stillness, waiting. Then, suddenly, it struck the water, emerging moments later with a fish clutched delicately in its beak. The moment was fleeting, almost mundane, yet it struck Elias with profound clarity. Life, too, required patience and precision. We wait, we watch, and when the time comes, we act, not out of desperation, but out of readiness. Freedom wasn't about seizing control. It was about trusting the process, knowing that even in stillness, movement is possible. The sun climbed higher, warming the air around him. People began to trickle into the park, children chasing each other across the grass, couples walking hand in hand, solitary figures jogging along the paths. Elias observed them quietly, marveling at how effortlessly they wove themselves into the fabric of the morning. Each person carried their own story, their own labyrinth, their own journal waiting to be written. Yet none of them seemed burdened by the weight of it. They simply lived, moving forward with grace and grit, navigating the complexities of existence without needing to resolve them. Philosophers often spoke of the human condition in grand terms, as a quest for truth, a struggle for meaning, a confrontation with mortality. But sitting here, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the park, Elias saw it differently. Life wasn't a riddle to be solved or a mountain to be conquered. It was a dance, a series of movements, sometimes fluid, sometimes awkward, always evolving. To live freely was to embrace the dance, to let go of the need for perfection, and instead revel in the imperfection of it all. His gaze returned to the pond, where ripples from the heron's strike still lapped gently against the shore. He thought of the countless choices that had brought him here, the decision to leave the village, the courage to face the labyrinth, the vulnerability to connect with strangers. Each choice had been a ripple, spreading outward in ways he couldn't predict. And now, sitting in this park, he realized that his journey wasn't ending, it was expanding. The labyrinth had taught him how to navigate uncertainty. The city had shown him how to weave himself into the world. What came next would be something entirely new, shaped not by walls or streets, but by the infinite possibilities of his own imagination. Elias closed the journal and tucked it safely inside his coat. Rising from the bench, he took one last look at the park. The heron now perched on a low branch, drying its feathers in the sunlight, the children laughing as they chased bubbles that shimmered like fragments of rainbows, the joggers weaving between shadows and light. Then, with steady steps, he turned and walked away, leaving behind only the faint impression of his presence. The city awaited him, teeming with stories yet untold, connections yet unmade, choices yet unchosen. Somewhere deep within him, he knew the labyrinth would always remain, a part of him, invisible but ever present, guiding him even as he forged ahead. But he also knew this. He was no longer its prisoner. He was its keeper, its witness, its storyteller. And so, Elias stepped into the flow of the city, disappearing into the crowd, ready to write the next chapter, not just for himself, but for the world he touched with every step. For in the end, freedom wasn't about finding answers. It was about learning to ask the right questions, and trusting that the journey itself would reveal everything worth knowing.